Hello and welcome to the Alt Annual Conference. We are in the final hours here in our online program today, and I'm really, truly delighted to introduce our next speaker, Dara Coakley, who's going to speak to us about online, hybrid, and hyflex delivery through the lens of UDL. Dara, if you're ready, I'm going to hand over to you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Maren. And hello, everyone. And thanks very much for making the time to come along today. I really genuinely appreciate it. So, as Maren mentioned, my name is Dara Coakley. Maren very wisely asked, is that a silent GH? And it actually is awkward Irish kind of name. But look, I'm delighted to be here. And as I said, thank you so much for coming along to the session. Something that I mentioned in one of my pre-recorded sessions is yeah, I'm from basically in Ireland, the same place that Roy Keane is from, and I'm a very proud Corkman, but I'm aware that the accent can be a bit of a challenge. And when I present as well, I have a tendency to speak faster and faster, and the accent becomes like more and more Cork, do you know what I mean? So if at any stage I become unintelligible, I might ask one or all of you to let me know. And you might also forgive any technical glitches. Something that I put up in the Discord on Tuesday was that I have an awful dog wandering around somewhere here as well. So please do forgive any technical issues. And just a note, I'm from the Department of Technology Enhanced Learning in Munster Technological University, the Cork campus, and it's www.mtu.ie if you'd like to know more. But I'll put up relevant kind of links and so on and so forth at the end of the session. And I also just FYI started a timer on my phone because I'll get into it at the end, but I really would welcome feedback and your own thoughts and perspectives and experiences for what I'm about to talk about today. So, look, without wishing to retread ground that's been gone over too many times, I think maybe a good place to start for this session is at the origins of UDL. So, in their book, Reach Everyone by Bailing and Tobin, they identified that universal design for learning was actually inspired by the universal design movement in architecture and product development. And in Universal Design for Learning, Guidelines for Accessible Online Instruction, Roger Shaw's also identified that it applies Roland Mace's universal designs in architecture to teaching and learning. And essentially, what that means is that the term universal design, or UD, which was coined by the architect Roland Mace and his colleagues in the Center for Universal Design, they identified universal design as the design of products and environments to be usable but to the greatest possible extent by people of all ages and abilities. So this notion that kind of building design and any physical infrastructure design should be accessible to all. And Hitchcock and Meyer have a good, I suppose, way of tying those two together. And they mentioned that the UDL framework helps us to see that inflexible curricular materials and methods are barriers to diverse learners, the same way inflexible buildings are barriers to people who face physical challenges. So I thought that was quite a nice way of joining the two. And in researching about this, there is kind of an interesting history about the UDL movement and how it kind of grew from this range of additional elements, starting with in the states legal access to education, to physical access to buildings, to the Individuals with Disability Education Act, which is mentioned there, which identified that students with disabilities are entitled to access, participation, and progress. But that whole history is maybe for another presentation. Um, but in terms of the current iteration of UDL, it really has its roots, as is identified by Boysen there, in the Center for Applied Special Technology, who in the 90s began to design or promote instructional methods designed to equalize accessibility for K-12 students with disabilities. And so CAST have developed a very useful set of guidelines in terms of universal design for learning. And those really are kind of identified there. I'm sure they're familiar to a great many people, but those are really based on three core principles, which is providing multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means and actions of action and expression. And I suppose one major change which has happened to the kind of CAST guidelines, to the UDL guidelines, is that they have come to kind of go beyond just access to education. They now, I think, also very much include pedagogical guidelines and pedagogical elements there. And if we look at the provision of one of the guidelines under the provision of multiple means for engagement, it also specifies in Guideline 8 that there should be options for sustaining effort and persistence included in curriculum design. And you can see there in the kind of sub-points, kind of the heightening and salience of goals and objectives, varying demands and resources, so on and so forth. So they really have gone beyond just access to education. And UDL obviously has expanded greatly, I suppose, particularly noticeably recently. And Boysen identifies that what began as a strategy for the inclusive education of school children with disabilities has expanded into a movement that claims to improve learning for all students in all settings. And certainly in terms of the growth of UDL, there's a number of different elements that or there's a range of kind of research that does indicate that this is happening at quite a pace. So Fornauf and Erickson have identified that the variety of UDL research identifies as a growing interest in transforming access and pedagogy in post-secondary settings. And in Ireland, there's a paper, Universal Design for Learning is Gaining Momentum in Irish Education, by Flood and Banks. And that identifies that, yeah, UDL is definitely on the rise within Irish education, from primary to secondary to post-secondary to higher education. But, because there's always a but, one paper which was developed in 2021 was by Boysen, and that paper was, I won't say scathing in terms of its analysis of UDL, but it did identify a number of similarities with UDL and I guess the now discredited concept of learning styles. And that is a paper by Guy Boysen, Lessons Not Learned, The Troubling Similarities Between Learning Styles and Universal Design for Learning. And he identifies that if the premise of UDL sounds familiar, it is because it also happens to be the central idea of learning styles, and that UDL shares a startling number of similarities with the now discredited concept of learning styles. For anyone maybe unfamiliar, learning styles is essentially identified there by Felder as this notion that students preferentially take in and process information in a number of different ways, specifically seeing and hearing, reflecting and acting, reasoning, and logically, so on and so forth. And it led to this idea of what kind of learner are you? Are you a visual learner or an auditory learner or a kinesthetic learner? And there was this notion in kind of a learning styles movement that learning is best done by appealing or supporting or personalizing learner for these different kind of learning styles. So if you're a visual learner, you should be providing the learner with visual elements, video images. If they're a kinesthetic learner, you should be providing learning by trial and error, hands-on activities, problem solving. Generally, learning styles has over the last number of years gone a bit out of fashion and kind of been fairly widely discredited. Boysen identifies 5 similarities between learning style theories and UDL: a lack of evidence for effectiveness, inadequate operationalization, an overemphasis on diversity in learning, overemphasis on matching instruction to diverse ways of learning, and overgeneralized neuroscientific justifications. But again, because there's a second but, Boysen does mention in that paper that although the purpose of the paper is to present a critical analysis, there's specific parameters to that criticism. So he identifies that the paper does not analyze universal design as a general approach to education, and there is other research and approaches such as universal instructional design and universal design for instruction, which have similarities and differences with UDL. The paper, he does not argue that UDL is ineffective nor that it should be abandoned, rather that it would benefit from some established best practice like setting clear objectives, encouraging collaboration, providing feedback. And he identifies that the paper is not a criticism of using universal design to increase educational access for students with disabilities. And he has a line that I like, which is, providing students with instructional materials they can process and respond to is educationally, ethically, and legally necessary. So my own interest and my own kind of confusion, I guess, around this was somewhat piqued by something that I had actually seen come up in terms of the growth of UDL in Ireland. And I guess for me, and this is entirely subjective to my own experience, something I'd seen at times here was occasions that when people spoke about UDL, people in higher education, when they spoke about UDL and UDL principles and the measures that should be put in place to support learners, it became a little hard to identify what exactly and ultimately was being provided for learners facing genuine challenges. In particular, learners facing geographical, physical, mental health, and economic kind of challenges. So the learners essentially who need support the most. And that did make me consider if, as Boysen argued, UDL was looking to meet all requirements, was there a danger of people interpreting UDL and providing measures and approaches that were too general, almost like learning styles, and ultimately forgetting the original intended purpose of UDL and who the origins of UDL were aimed at, which were students who had physical, mental health, geographical, and shamefully more so nowadays, economic barriers getting between them and effective education. So I guess the analogy that I might use is that they maybe kind of couldn't see the wood from the trees. Within the Department of Tel, I suppose this was important to me, and it was important to us in the Department of Tel because we would pride ourselves really on being very strong believers that online distance education and the use of technology in education can be an egalitarian force, and it can break down personal, social, and economic barriers, and that's something that we would put in our strategy and in our mission statement. So it really bothered me, this notion that kind of UDL might become this kind of tick box exercise, and that those learners who should be getting the most support would almost be afterthoughts to these kind of discussions. So what I wanted to do for this session was I wanted to examine hyflex and hybrid delivery methods, and to see whether these would be effective mechanisms for providing and supporting UDL, in particular for those learners who I mentioned were facing physical, mental health, geographic, economical barriers. So kind of, and I guess my interest in kind of hyflex and hybrid also was developed based around, was also developed kind of based around, I suppose, post-COVID, what are mechanisms or what are things we could build upon after, I suppose, particularly in Ireland, this kind of rush to kind of go for everything to go back to normal, go back entirely to face to face. And some of this was supported by a survey that we did in the Department of Tel post COVID, for both staff and students across the entire university, trying to identify what was helpful, flexible, beneficial um, during the ERT, or emergency remote teaching period. And if you'd like to know more about that survey, there's a data set by my colleagues Garo de Sulawan and Tom Farley and Sean Lacey, data set on student experiences and perceptions of emergency remote teaching, ERT, in an Irish university. So in looking at hyflex delivery, and when I refer to hyflex, for the purposes of this session at least, I'm referring to what BD identified as multimodal courses which combine online and on-ground or classroom-based student experiences. So hyflex for me, I suppose the big differentiator between hyflex and hybrid is the additional flexibility that hybrid provides, both from a location geographical point of view, but also from, I suppose, a chronological point of view, in terms of when learners can actually attend, access material and kind of classes. That book developed by BD, Hybrid Hyflex Course Design, is a really fantastic resource for anyone looking to know more. So in talking about a hyflex design, BD identifies four kind of key principles, or four values and principles of hybrid flexible course design. And those are learner choice, equivalency, reusability, and accessibility. And what I was interested in was in taking those very useful guiding principles and trying to compare those and see where those might overlap with UDL principles. So the UDL principles identified there. So, like, without going too into depth, because life is too short in terms of each and any of these, and listening to me droning on, um, I did find that there was quite a bit of substantial overlap between a number of UDL principles and learner, and in a hyflex classroom, learner choice, which is about providing meaningful alternative participation modes, and enabling students to choose between participation modes daily, weekly, or topically, between UDL principles and equivalency, which was about providing learning activities in all participation modes, leading to equivalent learning outcomes, reusability, which was about utilizing artifacts from learning activities in its participation mode as learning objects, and accessibility, which is equipping students with technology skills and equitable access to all participation modes. So I did find there was substantial overlap between the UDL principles and the values and principles BD identified for hybrid flexible course design. And a very useful research paper from here in Ireland was developed in Dublin, trialing hyflex at TU Dublin, stakeholders' voices and experiences. So this is essentially a evaluation of hyflex kind of delivery kind of initiative from the point of view of all different stakeholders, students, and lecturers and support. And there were some very interesting findings in that, which I feel are pretty relevant to the discussion at hand. So when talking about student barriers and access to education, that paper identified that 92% of students would recommend a flexible attendance mode, and they identified that issues such as distance from the campus, travel costs, health, general flexibility, and inclusiveness all factored into kind of that decision. And a different consideration is the effect that students identified, which the hyflex mode had on their well-being. For example, it improved their grades. I used to be exhausted after work, track to college, sometimes fell asleep in class. I wasn't alone. And another student identified it allows for a better work-life balance. And a number of students who self-reported disabilities felt that the hyflex mode added a lot to them in terms of equal opportunity, and in particular, individuals with ADD, ADHD, and as identified there, people with neurodiverse brains learn better in their own pace, in their own safe environment. And that was reflected as well in terms of the stakeholders within the paper. They have these vignettes from a number of learning support officers who identified a number of benefits that were reported to them by students with a view to hyflex. And I like this kind of almost as a summary quote. At this point, I wouldn't, from a student, this point, I wouldn't even consider going back into the campus. Wild horses couldn't return me to that way of life. It's had a profound positive effect on my mental health. So I thought that was quite a strong statement in support of hyflex. So in terms of hybrid delivery then, for the purposes of this session, I'm referring to hybrid as a combination of synchronous in-person and online learning experiences. So that notion, I suppose, where I would separate it from hyflex is the requirement to attend a live session, but that option being kind of in person or online. So in terms of hybrid design, I didn't have a book like Beatty to kind of draw from in terms of kind of guiding principles. But a paper that I did find, which I found very useful, was this paper, Expanding Learning Opportunities for Graduate Students with hyflex. And when they say hyflex, for the purpose of my presentation, it's much more aligned to actual hybrid. So they say hyflex, I say hybrid. But the point is that they identified within this paper 4 positive themes and 1 theme of concern. So could hybrid classes help accommodate student needs and life circumstances? Could they help meet students' different learning styles and strategies? Could they help increase access to course content and instruction? And could it help encourage student choice and control through choosing the mode of participation? And I was fortunate enough that we had a initiative in MTU in 2022 called Student Inc., which is about kind of encouraging student entrepreneurs to assess the feasibility of their business ideas, essentially giving them funding and training to take them from budding entrepreneurs to actual entrepreneurs. And this, in 2022, this initiative was delivered in a hybrid format, supported by us in the Department of TEL. So I was luckily able to evaluate the students who participated in that, who engaged in that hybrid mode with a view to UDL and a number of additional elements. So returning to those kind of 5 themes as identified in this paper, students were generally very positive in terms of each of the themes which were presented. So the majority identified that they did help accommodate student needs and life circumstances, they did help meet students' learning styles, they did help increase student access, and maybe to a lesser degree, they did help to encourage student choice and control. But through that Student Inc. initiative and through the hybrid experience of the students, I was also able to um, try and evaluate the student experiences according to the actual UDL principles. Now, I did, it is a limitation of this study, I did certainly do a little paraphrasing in terms of how I expressed the UDL principles just to try and make them understandable to the student. But I did try and kind of break down the UDL principles and get students to evaluate each principle with a view to their experience of the hybrid classroom. So again, without kind of, because life is too short and your time is too precious, I'm not going to go into every single into detail about every single kind of principle and every single finding. But what I would say as something of a summary is that certainly within the kind of UDL principles, students were generally very, very positive and reported extremely positively on principles related to access, as one might expect, less so in terms of principles around building or about internalizing. But I guess those principles, for example, about sustaining effort and persistence, language and symbols, self-regulation, comprehension, and executive function, I would argue those are more maybe pedagogical. And the hybrid classroom, no matter how good it is maybe not going to tie directly into the curriculum design, the teaching approaches, or the kind of pedagogical decisions that drive the student experience in terms of content, assessment, so on and so forth. But I did manage to sneak this question in at the end of the evaluation, and it was the one which personally I was kind of most interested in. And it was that, do you think the hybrid classroom could help support students facing geographical, physical, mental health, economic barriers? And all of the respondents were entirely unanimous in that it could. Again, I won't go into too much detail here, but I asked them from a qualitative point of view about that. And some of the feedback was that students found just for a bit of context, students were dispersed all over the country when they participated in this. So a number of students identified they just couldn't have participated if the lectures went hybrid or online, that the commuting distance was too much, that they had financial reasons, family commitments, that there's a lack of, as I'm sure there is in many places, shamefully, a lack of access to accommodation. Some students had medical conditions, some students had family obligations, so on and so forth. So, in terms of the conclusions to this, I suppose generally the entire process of, after all that research and reading, and basically arguing with myself, and like this, researching this thing has been kind of unusual for me, because it's basically been a couple of weeks of me just arguing with myself back and forth. I have a very unsatisfying set of conclusions, is what I'm getting to, mainly because they're very subjective and they're really just coming from a series of arguments I've been having with myself. So genuinely, I would very much, I suppose the conclusions that I'm offering here, they're a bit of a side note. What I'd really be interested in is your own experiences, your own perspectives, and your own thoughts on this. And I would like this to be a conversation rather than any kind of conclusion, because the conclusions that I'm offering are not particularly satisfying to me or to anybody. Um, so maybe just a disclaimer as a bit of a start. I am conscious that with all the moaning and the liberal referencing of poison and so on and so forth, that I might come across as disparaging of UDL. That's really not my intention. I would say that all UDL measures and considerations, even the kind of ambiguous ones that I spoke about earlier, the kind of tick box ones, I would argue they're all worthy. I would argue none of this is unimportant, and none of it should not be pursued, no matter how minor a measure towards the UDL principle is. I would argue that it absolutely has its place, and it absolutely should be put in place. I guess for me, what it kind of boils down to is that the issues that I see and my own subjective experience of what I mentioned earlier about kind of reducing UDL implementation to this kind of tick box activity and leaving out the students who need the support the most. I don't see that as a fault of the framework. I see that as a fault of people's interpretation or the application of it. And I don't think it's a deliberate thing, but I would say that certainly some situations I've seen people are relatively selective and self-serving in their application of the UDL principles. And I feel when we are selective and self-serving, with our application of the principles, that is when it does resonate with me in terms of what Boysen spoke about in terms of UDL and learning styles and the overlap there. And I suppose the entire thing for me is a desire for UDL to not become this tick box activity, that it becomes, that there's a lot done in terms of measures, which is essentially for personalization of the learning to students. And then there's very, very little being done for students who literally can't attend or can't access education because of, as I mentioned, geographical, physical, economic barriers. One thing which did cross my mind was that one possible measure in terms of avoiding that situation would be to take a very extreme interpretation of the UDL principles. So to be absolutely firm that each of the principles should be adhered to the maximum degree in terms of the implementations that are put in place. So when we say multiple means of engagement, that is not simply putting subtitles on a video, which someone might put up. It's asking, okay, well, what means of engagement, what means of access are we putting in place for students who can't come to the live in-person sessions? The research and the kind of feedback that I would have gotten is that certainly it does indicate that hybrid and hyflex do come with elements of UDL baked into them, particularly in terms of the comparison that I mentioned there, in terms of access for students facing challenges, and also for how hybrid and hyflex can align and kind of meet many of the important elements of the UDL principles. That's not to suggest that UDL actions must be hybrid or hyflex or they don't count, but certainly hybrid and hyflex should be given serious consideration in terms of meeting UDL requirements. And that is not something that I've seen much of in my own experience. And just as a semi-final point, I'm aware that hybrid and hyflex require time, investment, a massive change of systems. But if you are rigorous and adhering to actual application of the UDL principles, so does everything else. And there's a quote I like there. Some scholars have suggested that UDL must actively dismantle ability-central practices that permeate formal education. So when you consider that, putting in place hybrid and hyflex technical measures and technologies is actually probably the easier kind of part of the job. Just as a final thing, Laurie Phipps, who is an individual and an edtech I greatly admire, had a wonderful way of summarizing this, speaking about kind of working with JISC around kind of supporting learners faced with disabilities. He identified that when you set a minimum standard, that is what people achieve. And that is something I would not like to see happen with UDL, that it does become, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of tick box activity that like, get them to throw subtitles on a video. And so we're adhering to the UDL principles, that at the core of the UDL principles and the interpretation of them, students who need the most support, who are facing the most challenges, they should be front and center. And I do feel that hybrid and hyflex are very effective mechanisms for meeting those student requirements. So I spoke for way longer than I intended to, and thank you so much for your time and your attention. If anyone wants a copy of the references or slides, I'm happy to provide those. Otherwise, if you'd like to know more, our website is tel.cit.ie. And thank you so much for your time and attention.
Wow, thank you, Dara. That was a fantastic presentation, and there have been multiple requests for the slides. You have also been signed up to a prolonged workshop for ALT because there is a lot of demand to hear more from you. So there's been lots of comments in the chat for people who'd like to hear more from you. Just to give you an opportunity to pick up maybe one or two of the comments here. So I know Vicky Dale has posted a couple of comments around your earlier part of the presentation, and also Peter Hartley made quite a lot of comments regarding just picking up one of Peter's questions around interested in ways that ideas and movements are changed or developed and the often unrecognized consequences. So maybe, Dara, just as a final reflection, what are your thoughts on the future for UDL?
Thanks very much for that, Peter. It's a very good question. And it's a very unsatisfying answer. I really don't know. I do think that UDL certainly within an Irish higher education context, UDL is definitely being pushed very hard, which is great in one way, but it does present that potential situation that I spoke about where, oh, we're great at UDL because if someone if a lecturer puts up a video, which they might do once or twice over the semester, the subtitle is there. I would like to see genuine engagement, and I think I would like to see um, in any discussion around UDL principles and measures being put in place, I would like to see the question to be repeatedly asked. What about students who are facing physical challenges attending live sessions? What about students facing economic challenges, which shamefully is more and more so the case in Ireland? What about students who have mental health issues? I would like to see those students put front and center, and kind of anything that kind of comes, I suppose, after that, um, for the vast majority of students who are, fortunate enough to be able to attend live, to be able to kind of come into a bricks and mortar institution and sit down in a classroom, anything that serves their needs is absolutely fantastic. But I feel like almost like there should be a priority in the application of UDL guidelines and measures for the students who need the support the most. Well, hopefully that made some kind of sense.
Yeah.
Like I said, I've been arguing with myself, but my relationship with myself has been terrible while I've been researching this. So you're probably privy to another argument between me and me unfolding in front of you.
Well, I think there was a lot of appetite to delve deeper into this and to expand on that. Dara, it would be fantastic if you were happy to share the link to the slides either on Discord or on here. There's been so many comments and rich discussions and reflections, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So from all of us here, I can see lots of people putting their hands together for you here in the chat, but also from us here at the Alt Annual Conference. Thank you for joining us, and have a really good very last session of the conference, everybody. Thank you, Dara.